Thanks, everybody, and thanks for making the time today. As Andrew noted, it's another big day of change for the organization. I just want to say at the outset, not from this area, haven't been on campus before, but David Williams is the reason that we're all here together and that this is happening. And I want to make sure that you know how grateful I am to be able to spend a few minutes with you all, how grateful I am to him and the role he played at the organization. I only had a little bit of contact with him, but the power that he brought to that conversation persuaded me that this series was really a really interesting thing, and it even convinced my boss to let me come out and join part of it. So I just want you to know that I'm grateful for your time, and I'm grateful for him and the role he played at Vanderbilt. So you've had a series here on campus around the Olympics. Can we just take 1 second? Has anyone been to any of the previous sessions by a show of hands? And now keep your hands up if you've been at multiple of them. More than one, okay, so that's really neat. I think I love the idea of this series. And so part of the fun of this for me is to talk to people who have been thinking about the Olympics and what it means, particularly tying it to society generally. I think sport in general can have a super powerful and positive effect on society. That's why I ended up moving to the Olympic Committee. I think the Olympics is a place where sport touches so many people in so many ways. And you've been hearing very diverse topics on this, sort of really different ways in to the Olympics. And the thing that all these have in common is what we call the Olympic movement. So particularly as it's just us, what I'm excited about here is talking with you about what this looks like to you. What do you need an Olympic committee for in the United States? And that's where I want to get. So I wish you'd raise your hand or just shout out if you're reacting to something or something doesn't make sense or is uninteresting and we should move on to something else. I'd really like to do that because that's the fun of this for me. I spend my time in the legal department at the U.S. Olympic Committee worried about very specific, weedy legal things, and sometimes you lose the perspective of what this whole thing means. What's the import to people? So what we'll do today for a few minutes, if it's okay, so bringing this to the conversation you've been part of over the weeks, I'll tell you how the USOC is set up. I'll tell you about the Olympic movement globally and where we fit in. I'll tell you how we're formed to play a part of that global movement and the history of it just a little bit, just so you have a sense for how this thing looks to me as I work at the Olympic Committee. That gets us ready for the punchline, and this is really what I'd like to talk about, though, because we want to tie it to society. So for me, my part of this is I work at one of the teams that participates in the Olympics. That team represents the United States. That team will be made up of athletes who are going to swim or otherwise compete in sport for their country. What do you need in our country? What do you need an Olympic committee for? And are we doing the things that you need us to do? Are there other things we should be doing instead? That's a thing that we're really wrestling with, and I'd love to get a sense from you what that looks like. So I'm going to start, as you must, when you have limited presentational skills, with a video that can give interest. Last week, a couple of you might have been here. There was a gentleman, as part of the series, talking about what does it mean to host an Olympics, and he used the Rio de Janeiro Games as an example of that. And I think he took a pretty dark view of what it can mean to a city, what does the Olympic movement represent. There are things to be cynical about in the Olympic movement, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But I have to say, I'm the other guy in that conversation. I worked in the commercial sphere for many years, traded the Bay Area for Colorado Springs, and sort of traded salary for meaning. And so I have to tell you, I'm that guy who really believes that there is a bit of magic in the middle of all this, though. All of the stuff that we can otherwise be cynical about. So I have to refer back to the magic. This is really what we're doing.
The games are officially open.
These are the moments that just make your heart feel like it's going to explode.
Red Gerard now. The teenager is now the Golden Champ Colorado. Mr. Freeze, oh my God.
That triple axel moved down in the record books.
26-year-old Andrew Kurgan is getting flat out fly. Andrew Kurgan to the line, into first.
Did you get that reduction you were looking for?
I got that. 1, 2, 3, 1!
who I am and what I can do.
Oksana Masters dealing with an injury as she arrives in Pyeongchang.
It was extremely excruciating, but yeah, mind over matter. I wish I could hug you right now and tell you that
This is the greatest redemption.
Oh, nice and clean. Jamie Anderson is golden once again. Forward and front. Team USA gets it done. The three-peat complete. Paralytic gold again. Oksana Masters bursting to the finish line, and she's the first time gold medal winner at the Paralympic Games.
Gorgeous squad. This is number 6. Yes! Oh, the real league champ just showed up at the Olympics. He needs the back-to-backs to take down Ayuba.
Welcome to the show, Tom McKim.
Five on the board for Team USA.
And we Mike Schultz into the gold medal position.
I'm just deciding this out right now.
Here comes Sewell. It's a four-way battle down the stretch. Andy Sewell is winning the gold medal for Team USA.
That means so much. It feels so incredible.
there's no words. This is the greatest honor for our team.
I don't know, I'm proud. Proud to have given it my all.
My Olympic journey may end today, but theirs is just getting started.
All right, I'm going to test your patience with a bunch of slides about organization and dry stuff like that. But it's good to start, and I promise we'll end, remembering that this is really about people, human beings, and athletes in particular, who make commitments personally, make sacrifices personally of a type that gets them onto a world stage like this. And being part of making that happen and those moments happen, whether it's win or lose, as Pierre de Coubertin, the guy who founded the modern Olympics, really was always talking about, it's really about getting everyone together and competing in that way. It's not about winning a particular medal. It really does have meaning. I really think that's true. So there's magic in this. Let's look at how it's organized and then test ourselves a little bit about whether it's organized in just exactly the right way, but let's not lose sight of that stuff. So we talk about the movement, the Olympic movement. A lot of people misunderstand how this works, so I won't go on and on, but I do think it's sort of interesting, and I didn't get it till I showed up at the USOC. Let's remember, it's a global movement. It's run by this organization at the top of this slide, the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, based in Switzerland. So they are the holders of the rings, the 5 interlocking rings. It's their game that we all play in. They are founded in Switzerland. A lot of international sporting organizations are founded there, based there for tax and other reasons, but very independent of all the people that participate in it. So if you look at the 206 national Olympic committees, that's where we fit. We're one of 206 of these committees, 206 of these organizations, everyone in a different country, more countries than there are in the UN, in fact. Separate entities that all kind of play in the game, play in the sandbox of the International Olympic Committee. Next to us, these international federations. These are nonprofit entities, globally based, that will focus and lead a particular sport. So the IF, the International Federation for Equestrian Sports, is down the block in Lausanne from the IOC. The IF for tennis is in another part of the world. The IF for swimming is in another part of the world. All run separately. All have something in common. They have a high degree of volunteer leadership. And so they're less about, this is going to sound, you'll test me on this, but it's less about money and more about power. if you don't mind my saying that. The people that run the IOC they're not paid to lead it, they're volunteers. They are potentates and big shots from their different countries in the world of sport. They volunteer their time to lead the IOC. Same is true of the IFs. Very largely true of the NOCs, but what that means is the environment around these organizations can become very, very political. And people trade in power and status in some ways. And that is the basis, I'll argue, for a lot of what we react to a little bit cynically, a lot of what we get concerned about in the Olympic movement. And it loses the connection sometimes with the athletes, and we'll come back to that. National federations, I have them at the bottom, but just because they're influenced by both of the blue boxes. National federations are the domestic lead for a particular sport. We've got 50 of them in the US, and these are what we call our NGBs, national governing bodies, one each for volleyball and swimming and archery and table tennis and badminton. Every one of those, a separate nonprofit entity somewhere in the United States. A whole bunch of them have moved to Colorado Springs, where we are at the Olympic Committee, because that city has really tried hard to be a good resource for amateur sport. But it's an important thing to remember. There are all of these organizations trying to play together in this world, where we are one of these 206. So we have to play by the rules that the IOC sets. The national federations that we call NGBs, they have to play by our rules to be associated with the Olympic Committee, and then the IF's rules as well. So you can see for every of these organizations, a lot of your time is spent negotiating with and trying to live with people in other such organizations. On the Paralympic side, very similar situation. A International Paralympic Committee based in Germany, international federations, there are 27 in this case, 178 of the National Paralympic Committees. Of those, only 5 in the world are both the National Olympic Committee and the National Paralympic Committee, and we're one of those. So the USOC is the National Paralympic Committee serving the IPC, and the National Olympic Committee serving the IOC. So why are those things so separate? Here's the thing to remember about the USOC in this world. We're the odd duck among the 206 in the sense, and we'll get to this, but it's a very American setup that we have at the USOC. Almost all the NOCs, almost all the NPCs are governmental entities funded by, created by the national governments of the countries. Makes perfect sense. Every country wants to try to send its best team to the Olympics. Let's give this to the government to put together and organize. And we'll have a sports minister, and that sports minister will support sort of grassroots sports for everyone to participate in, and elite sport to send a team to the Olympics. Same for the Paralympics. In most cases, different guys, because it's a very different organization. In our case, singularly, among the 206, no federal government involvement, no federal funding, no tax funding, no public support of any kind. And I'll take you into why, but the way our government set the USOC up, it said, okay, we're going to let you be the Olympic Committee. We're going to give you a way to go earn money to support the elite athletes around the country, but you got to do it on your own. So that makes us a little bit different than the other organizations. It's one of the reasons why it makes perfect sense for us to try to lead both the Olympics and the Paralympics, because the way that we generate support for them is very similar. All right, please don't try to read this, and apologies. I'm just your lawyer, so I grabbed slides from other people and cobbled them together, but you just to give a sense. So here are these same parties. How do these things all tie together? And again, just to give you a sense that we're just in the corner of this thing, there's the IOC, International Olympic Committee, at the top. This is all their game on the Olympic side. They've got these members, 115 maximum right now. It's actually right up around 100 right now. These are people who are volunteers, leaders in sport in their countries, elected to serve on the executive board and as members generally. What do the IOC members do? They set the rules for all the rest of us. They arrange the games, award them to different cities to host, and there are the organizing committees right under them. So right now we're looking forward to Tokyo, Paris, and LA. We know Beijing in 2022. This summer we'll find out who's going to host the Winter Games in 26. Anyway, the IOC sets for these organizing committees. They say, okay, Los Angeles, you get to host in 2028. Here are the rules how to do it. Get to work. Let us know how you're doing on picking the sports and that kind of stuff. But this separate entity will host the games. The athletes' experience is going to be driven by a number of these groups. They're going to go to the games held by the organizing committees, but they're going to be affiliated with the National Olympic Committees through these national federations, our NGBs. The IFs, the international federations, will make the rules for each of the sports. And then finally, we have continental associations where each of the continents, one for each of the 5 rings, has their own organization. So we're part of the Pan American Sports Organization, based in Miami and in Mexico, that has the Pan Am Games this summer in Lima, Peru, that's open only to countries in North, Central, and South America. So we have to kind of, sorry to make it sound like this, but we have to answer to the Pan Am sports guys for our continent. We have to answer to the IOC globally and the IPC on the International Paralympic side. And then we have to work with the IFs, all of this to try to drive a good experience for those guys in the middle, the athletes, who, you know, again, from the legal side, I see them struggling sometimes just to figure out what all the rules are, because their lives are impacted by the IF rules and their national federations and the NOCs and the IOC and everybody else. So all that to say, sometimes in the US, we get a little bit comfortable with ourselves and we feel like, well, we're running the Olympics, but we're absolutely not. We're just one of the 206 guys in one of those boxes. And then, you know, just across the country, so you have a sense, in North America where we are, it's not even the most of the movement. What's interesting, look at where all the members are from. There are 96 overall right now. We've got 17 in all of the Americas. 41 of the IOC members are in Europe. Do you see that? So this global organization in sport is, if you'll forgive my saying so, is heavily Europe-centric. It comes from the European countries and cultures in a way. Still very much driven in that part of the world. Where in Africa, you know, 13 members. In Oceania, with such a large population, only 6, we're off in the corner in a way. We're not in the biggest part of the world when it comes to power and influence among international sport. That's really in a different part of the world, and we'll get to why that makes our lives sort of interesting. But if we can just put a period there and say, so we're just one of 206. We're not in the biggest, most powerful part of that organization. We need to try to take the resources that we do have, the influence that we do have, and be a voice for sort of positive change in this organization, but it's not all up to us. Does that make sense? All right, but we've got an Olympic committee. This is your team in this whole thing. This is the American team that we would send to the Olympics or the Paralympics. And let's talk a minute about that, the USOC. So who are we? There's our little building in Colorado Springs. We've been there now for 40 years. Used to be in New York City at the New York Athletic Club when Olympic sport was very much a clubby kind of a thing. Now we're very much a nonprofit based nationally, but with our home in Colorado Springs, both the Olympic and the Paralympic Committee, as I said. And then we send the teams. We assemble the teams to go compete in these events. Right? That's the primary thing I think that people think of for the organization. That's the thing that's tied most closely to our mission. I'm going to show you in a minute that our lives are not quite that simple, but that's the basis for what we're doing. So what goes into the USOC in our world? Here are the national governing bodies. Just a picture of all their logos to underline that there are 50 of them, and they're all over the country. So pick your favorite sport, the one that you care the most about, and your guys are in there somewhere. USA Squash, for example, is not an Olympic sport. They're campaigning with their IF every year to get on the Games program for the next Games. That's what they would like to be in the Olympics. Right now they're in Pan Am Games in the Americas. We'd love it if they can make it, but we have nothing to say about that. Absolutely nothing to say. That's between them and their IF and the IOC, right? So there's one kind of very small entity where their aspiration is to become an Olympic entity. Look over at USTA on the right, US Tennis Association. They are also a 501c3. They are also one of our national governing bodies. But what part does the Olympics play in their business model? Almost none, right? USTA has hundreds of thousands of members around the country, where the business model they've got is participatory tennis. And tournaments and competitions at all levels, seniors and juniors and all over the country. They're based in Florida. They have big training academies. the Williams sisters really like to participate in the Olympics. So I'm oversimplifying, U.S. Tennis Association puts up with us and says, okay, I'll be an NGB. Just tell me what I have to do. But this is the 1% of my day, right? Because when the games come, I'm going to send some high-profile tennis players. But it has very little to do with my life outside of that. USA Golf is similar to tennis in that way. USA Cycling, very much tied to international competitions and really has a close relationship with us and with the International Amateur Athletic Association. But does that make sense? And it's a thing that people don't always understand. These are all separate companies. They all have their separate plan. And the Olympics fits into their plans in different ways. So we're negotiating with these guys all the time, trying to help organize them with no actual oversight over the operation of their business. But we have some influence because you can't be one of the NGBs unless you play by the rules that we set. And we'll talk about that in a minute. On the Paralympic side, please don't memorize any of this either, but it's even more complicated. There are some of the sports where the Olympic NGB, National Governing Body, also governs the Paralympic sport part. Those are in the middle. There are some if you look on the left, we have these things called high performance management organizations where there isn't a national governing body for the sport. On the right, you see our similar circles. In this case only, we act as the NGB for a number of sports on Paralympics because there isn't an organization willing to put the time and the money into supporting that sport. So we'll do whatever we have to and work with whomever we have to try to get athletes in a position where they can compete internationally on the greatest stage, the Paralympics, right? If you think of being a Paralympic cyclist, that's where you want to compete. And if you want to do that from the US, well, what are you guys doing for me? There is not an NGB for that. So we set one up and we run it out of Colorado Springs to try to help people get ready to compete. So similarly, except for those circles on the right, lots of different organizations, lots of different business models. We try to lasso them together and keep them on the same set of rules. But they each have their own business models. All right. What about us? I want to show you where our money comes from and where it goes, just at a high level, because that's a question that is always at the top of people's minds in the movement. It's been a matter of a little bit of controversy in the last year, because you'll hear athlete advocates say, are you spending money on athletes or are you spending money on, I don't know, on expense accounts and fancy bottles of wine or whatever it is? Because the USOC has a duty to athletes. That's 100% right. So let me just tell you where the money comes from. The most of it from sponsorship and licensing. Companies domestically want to be associated with the Olympics. United Airlines is a partner of Team USA and the U.S. Olympic Committee. That's a sponsorship deal where they put money in and we give them access to the rings and the Team USA marks. That's a sponsorship deal. Licensing deals are many times where you're selling Team USA mark clothing at retail and that kind of thing. The broadcast element is a really big one. NBC is our broadcast partner in the United States through one of those Titanic kind of sports sponsorship, sports broadcasting deals that you hear about for baseball or football. They're the Olympic broadcaster in the United States. They send a whole bunch of money to the IOC, and then a share of that comes to us at the USOC. And then in the lower left-hand corner, contributions, we've got a growing part of our business model, which is fundraising, where we have donors that want to contribute, particularly for particular sports that they care the most about, and they want to see athletes really be able to compete at the highest level in sailing. We just got a gift that will be devoted towards sailing sports development. That's fantastic, and that's a way for people to be involved in the movement. But that's mostly where the money comes in. I'll just point out again, if this were almost any other country, this pie would be one color, and it would be government. So it would be government money that comes into the organization. And there's none of that in the United States. Where does the money go? Complicated, but look at the gray stuff. That's us running ourselves. Look at all the other colors. That's money that we send into sport for ultimately to support athletes, but in a whole bunch of different ways. So you see high performance programs, training facilities like our training centers, sending people to competitions, foundational programs for development of sport at all levels, promoting the athletes and that kind of thing. So that's where in different ways we're spending money that's trying to support athletes in the best way. And this is the hard question. In these different colors, where should the most of that money go? Should I send a check to an athlete so she can pay rent and go to train with somebody that she already knows that she wants to train with? Should I support a gym where she can go where they have coaches that are the best in the country? Should I support a nutritional program that helps her be as healthy and well as she can as an athlete and help support her training that way? Should I build a training center where she can come and get benefit of all of those things? We can have arguments about which is the most effective. Did you have a question?
I did. Go back to the last slide. So you're saying for other countries, right, high one-color government, if they're doing sponsorship deals, licensing deals, are those like the governments actually the ones entering those deals and getting the money back from that, or how does that piece work?
Yeah, it's a great point, and you're touching on there's a whole bunch of hybrids of that kind of a model. So, for example, in Great Britain, there's government funding and there's sponsorship funding, and so it would be two colors in that way. So the money is going to the government in that it's a government organization, but it doesn't go into the general pile and then through the crown to the organizing or the Olympic Committee. And then in a place like Hungary, they're just trying for the first time to get sponsors. So it's all blue and there's a little sliver of red. And in most of the countries, it's just how much do we get from the government this year. But it's a great point. So this, we'll come back to this because this is part of what I really want to keep testing ourselves on. And particularly as you've been thinking about this is a question anybody can have a go at. How should the money be spent to support athletes? And is the USOC doing a good enough job of devoting as much of the funds as it can to benefit athletes rather than for other things that you don't want us to work on? Hi.
So I think earlier you said there are 50 national governing bodies, and you're spending about a little over $400,000 on high-performance programs, which would imply, that each of those NGBs is getting somewhere around $100 million. But that's not the case, right?
No, indeed.
Which part of the pie would be the high-performance portion of national governing body programs, and what would be included in the blue part there?
So high-performance programs, and I won't get this exactly right because, again, I'm only your lawyer on this, but the high-performance programs, the biggest part is going to be where we're spending most directly on a sport resource, and we might place it in an NGB to make it available to them, or you might make it available directly to a group of athletes where there's not an NGB that can benefit of that. Athlete and NGB foundational programs would include things like, on the NGB side, helping the NGB as an organization succeed so it can do a better job for its athletes. So there's some of it in each of those things. Some of that is going through an NGB. But here's a thing, and it's a great point about this question. 50 NGBs, there's a theory when we think about how we spend the money, you should just take the big pile of money and divide it by 50 and send everybody a check and do your best. Because those guys know their sport best. The table tennis guys know what to do to support table tennis. The cycling guys know a lot more than us about cycling. That would be a view. And there was a time in our history where it wasn't exactly that, but it's kind of like that, where all the NGBs got their share, and you go away and do your best. And what we were finding, I say we, what my ancestors were finding, was that different of these 50 organizations have kind of different organizational capabilities. And they were doing different levels of work with the money. Some were doing great work, and some people were not doing such great work. But ultimately, what that led to was sort of an inefficiency. We were throwing a lot of money where it wasn't actually helping athletes because some of the, organizations just weren't able to manage it well. So we try to devote the money now to things that we can see will move the needle for athletes in particular sports. We're kind of in between. Because you could say, just give the money to the NGBs and let them figure it out. Or you could say, keep all the money yourself and just build a giant training center and you train all the athletes, USOC. And really, we're somewhere in between there right now trying to find the most efficient way. And people can argue about what would be the most effective. If we were that monolithic sports ministry created by the government, all the NGBs would be ours. And I will tell you, from the legal side, it's most people's impression in our country, I think, that all the NGBs are ours, so that the USOC is running them. So when something happens in NGB, people say, what the heck were you guys doing at the USOC? And I'm sorry to oversimplify, but I don't even know those guys. They're in Southern California with the group of people that really care about table tennis, running their own business. The connection they have with me is through this recognition as a national governing body. I don't get to determine their destiny. Well, you could argue maybe that's not the right way to do it. Maybe it should all be one big thing. But for reasons we'll talk about, that hasn't been the approach in the US to have a monolithic kind of government-run organization. part of the magic in the organization that we've got, and I really do think this is a good thing, and I'm not trying to advocate for it, but it's very American to say, let people focus on what they're best at and compete for resources. So the different NGBs, they come to the USOC every year and ask for more money. And the USOC spends the money with NGBs according to where it thinks it'll do the most good for sport. So what you have is people working really hard at these NGBs to do the best work and merit that money, the same way they might merit a sponsorship. That competition is really a good thing. To give the USOC a bunch of money from the government and say, you're budgeted $100 million every year, good luck. I mean, we've seen what that can do in other kinds of bureaucracy. People get a little too comfortable. Maybe they're not killing themselves to do the very best because they know they're getting that money every year. What they said to us is instead is, you get to go earn money from sponsorships, but it's up to you to create value to get that money. So we're trying harder. I think on the whole, it's a good thing, but we can't argue about it. Okay, we do have a couple of training centers, and we're almost done with the basics about us. One in Colorado Springs, one in Lake Placid. The COS facility has sports on both the summer and winter programs. Lake Placid, the site of the 1980 Olympics, is focused on winter sports, particularly the sliding sports, where you need a very specific kind of infrastructure. If you want to train to be a bobsled or a luge athlete, there's only one way to do it. You got to get on this course, and almost nobody has one. There are really only two great ones in the country, and one's in Lake Placid, and the other one is in Salt Lake. So we run these two training centers ourselves. And part of the thing we're talking about, how do you best spend the money? There are some things that we feel like if you can create a resource that's available to several of these NGBs, and it's a really great resource, that's better than each of them trying to build their own. So luge and skeleton and bobsled all use that track. But they don't all have to build their own track. They just share that one. Makes sense. So we can do a better job of that than they can. Let's have that at Lake Placid. At the COS Training Center, we have really good medicine and nutritional facilities so that, again, rather than every of the 50 NGBs hire the best nutritional counselor you can find, we've got these great guys in COS where you can send your athletes and learn this stuff in one place, much more efficient that way. So there are decisions every day to be made about what to do with these facilities, but you can see what they're focusing on now. These places both host camps for athletes at all levels, not just elite athletes. Our own use of the facilities is directed towards athletes that we're trying to train for international competition, so really elite athletes. There used to be three. The third one in San Diego, in Chula Vista. Does that sound familiar? That I had never been there before. There was a training center focused very much on the summer sports. 2 years ago, the USOC leadership said, okay, we're seeing that these are great sport facilities. We're not getting a lot of elite athlete benefit from them. So maybe we shouldn't be spending all the money to run that place. We'll just use some of it for our elite athletes. So the USOC sold this Chula Vista center to the city of Chula Vista for $1, and the city runs it. And they have other people running it. They run camps. They do everything else. And we get a certain number of nights in the beds, in the dorms, and a certain number of hours on the fields. So we're using that part of the facility that is actually benefiting the elite athletes. Does that make sense? There are a million ways that you could try to do this. That's what we tried to do there. Last thing, this is one of the most exciting things to me about where we are at the Olympic Committee right now, is we're going to host the games. So in 2028, Los Angeles will be the site for the Olympic Games. And I just show this as the final point about people think that we're just running this stuff. It's not us, it's these other guys. LA 2028 is an organization based in Los Angeles, headed by Casey Wasserman, who's a titan in sports marketing and in entertainment business. And he's put together a really powerful organization to organize the games for the Olympics in 2028. That's a separate organization from us. But in typically American fashion, we have contracts that tie us together. Instead of just putting the government in charge of putting on the games, government says, I don't really want to take all that risk. I don't want to spend all that money to run the games. And an organization like LA 28 says, well, in the US, I can run the games and fund it through sponsorships and donations. I won't take government money to do all that stuff. And I can make it pay and make it help the city. This goes back to the talk that some of you heard last week about Rio, because it's a test. Can you make it pay for the city? The LA guys would say, I'm going to make LA a slightly better city. It's already fantastic. I'm not going to build hardly any venues because we got them. I'm going to run this thing at a budget surplus and not take government money from it. And I'm going to have a great Olympics that the IOC thinks is really terrific. So they won the right to run the games, and here they go. They've got 9 years now to get ready to do this for the 2028 games. We have a huge stake in this working because we're going to be the host National Olympic Committee. So a couple things that go along with that, but one is the reason that we all care about this, that the magic that you saw that was happening to individual athletes at the beginning is really magnified when you are hosting it. Kids, people who were kids in 1984 in Los Angeles still come up to me and tell me stories about what having the Olympics in their hometown meant at that time, even apart from getting on the field to play. So having the games in the U.S., I really think is good for sport, particularly in sports that don't get a lot of kids involved in other ways. So team handball is a really big sport in Europe. It's really a great, I don't know if you've ever seen it, it's a good spectator sport. It's a neat sport. Nobody plays it in the U.S. But here's a thing that happens when you're the host National Olympic Committee. The IOC says, all right, you've done a lot of work, you're putting on the games. You get to have a team in every sport, no matter whether they're even that good or not. So we're going to have a team handball team in Los Angeles. That's a chance for that sport to try to catch hold, right? Think of what soccer has tried to do over the last 20 years in the U.S. Incredibly powerful sport elsewhere. Struggled to get traction here. You get an event like the World Cup in 1994, that really helped the sport. They've got it again in 2026. This is how you get kids sort of see themselves in a sport that they might not have seen. Particularly if you think sport can help make lives better and that athletes who are really committed benefit from it. Your grandchildren, I think you feel it. They have a kind of a discipline and they have a kind of a focus that most kids don't have. And there are pluses like that that you can find. So more of that has got to be better. I'm so excited that we're going to have the games and we'll be partners with the guys at LA 28. Different organization, different business model. We have contracts about how we share revenue and responsibilities, but we're going to be there trying to ensure that the games are a huge success. And I'll show you why you got to have us there. But anyway, that's a really exciting thing about the next 10 years. I'm going to stop all this, but the mission of the USOC is on the screen. It's now about 10 years old. So 3 things kind of go into it. I think that's worth thinking about because it'll get to this punchline about society. We're going to support athletes, that's what we're here for, in achieving sustained competitive excellence, that's one theme, demonstrating the values of the Olympic movement, that's 2 things, and thereby inspiring Americans, that's 3 things that are kind of, that the mission turns on. It's got to be about the athletes doing this, not us. We've been arguing about our mission during the last year and whether it needs an update. And I think we're going to get to a place, this is not public, but we're going to polish up our mission a little bit and make it a little bit more specific to what we're going to do for athletes to help them do that. You know who inspires Americans? Not me. Katie Ledecky does. Athletes do. So we're going to try to empower athletes to achieve competitive excellence and inspire Americans. The feeling that you get when you watch that Pyeongchang highlight reel is watching people who have worked so hard realize a moment that they've dreamed of and have earned so richly. That's what we need to, I think, we need to try to enable. So, list of things we're going to do about safety and integrity, about resources for mental and physical well-being, and then try to be a positive voice in the international movement. But we're trying to get a little bit more granular about what the USOC is going to do. That's different from the NGBs, different from the IFs, it's different from the IOC. We'll come back to this slide, but this is what I'd love to get input from anybody on, because I think it's a really important question for what our ultimate goal ought to be. That's the USOC. Now I'm just going to, I swear I'll make this short, but this is where this is the rules of the game, if you will. And so as your lawyer, this is my favorite thing, of course, and I spent a lot of time in these, but just to underline again what we're working with. What are we based on? We're based in the first instance on the Olympic Charter. That comes from the IOC. That's not up to us. They write it in Lausanne. It's the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence of the Olympic movement, quote unquote, where if I want to be an NOC, I got to play by its rules. So it has these chapters about the whole movement, us, the IFs, the IOC, and how a games is run, right? So we have to obey all those rules. If we don't want to, then they can kick us out, and we're not an NOC. So in the US, sometimes we like to think that we get to make the rules. It's not always 100% true. If I don't want to play by the IOC's rules, then I've got to do something other than be an Olympic committee. But then, what did we do in the US? Right? Most of the governments would set up their Olympic committee and just play by the charter rules. What the US government did 40 years ago now, 41, is say, yeah, we're going to have an Olympic committee too, but we're going to do it in this special way. Not going to give government funding. Instead, I'm going to set up the USOC as this nonprofit, set out its duties and powers like you would for any company, and then and it's going to recognize these NGBs. But here's the key moment. I'm going to give it exclusive rights to the marks. So in the Ted Stevens Act, this federal legislation, it says there will be this committee. It picks who the NGBs are for the different sports. It sends a team to the Olympics. It's in charge of hosting the games with our partnership. But I'm going to give it these rights. You guys get to control use of USOC and the rings, the 5 interlocking rings. And we have a little bit of other IP. But so if it's going to be Olympic in the US, you got to come to the USOC. And then they say, all right, USOC, go off and make money with that. So what do? In the legal department, we spend a lot of time protecting trademarks and keeping people who are not involved in the Olympic movement from using the 5 rings of the Olympics or Team USA in that way. Why do we do that? Because that's what we sell to companies. That's what we sell to United and to Coca-Cola and Visa and the other global and domestic sponsors. Instead of government funding, we generate money by creating commercial value. So it is a business, and it is about raising money. But I think it's a really neat U.S. innovation. Instead of taking more money from people that the government needs for other purposes, you go find your money elsewhere from corporate sponsors. And that's what the Ted Stevens Act gave us the right and the obligation to do, is use the rings to generate revenue. So like I said, for lawyers, we do a lot of contracts. For sponsorships, we do a lot of trademark protection. Many times when the games are coming, you see a local news story about how mean the Olympics guys are. That's often us, because we are the guys who send a letter. I swear we make it the nicest possible letter to the local butcher that hangs sausages in the shape of rings, because he's not an Olympic sponsor, and I need that for the people who are. So please, can you take your sausage rings down? You lousy son of a... And that is that's not always a popular position, but now you get why we got to do it though, right? That's our only reason to exist. It's our only thing to generate revenue. Why do I generate revenue? For that pie I was showing you, because I got to find different ways of supporting athletes, and that's where we get the money for it. So like I said, a lot of reasons to see that it feels like just a big business, and there's a lot to be cynical about. But in the US, we made it a business that benefits athletes in a way that they haven't done in any other country quite this way. I think it's really a smart way to do it. So I still think that we're organized in a way that can help people. We talked about the mission, and we talked about what, the punchline I want to get to. What do you need an Olympic committee for? We're thinking about sending teams to the Olympics and the Paralympics and the Pan Am Games and these international competitions. When Congress created us with this Ted Stevens Act 40 years ago, in the 70s, the U.S. Olympic team at that time had been just struggling, like pound for pound, just not performing in terms of getting athletes to the podium in a way. Think of a population of a country. How many elite athletes should you have? And so should you be showing well at the Olympics? We were just under-punching our weight in that way at that time. And part of the reason was in the 70s, you had all these organizations competing to send folks to the Olympics. So it was really inefficient, and there was a lot of arguing. So they were solving a problem when they created the Olympic Committee in its current form. They said, well, only these guys send athletes to the games. So you got to work with them. We'll get that organized. But when they created us in the 70s, they were thinking in terms of a sports ministry. So I want to show you in our, when you create a company, you create documents and you list the purposes for the company. Usually do that in a very general way. When they created us in this Ted Stevens Act that you can go look at online, these are the purposes for being for the USOC. Please you don't have to study this again. But look at the very top, national goals for amateur athletics. That's not just sending a team to the Olympics. That sounds like a sports minister, doesn't it? It sounds like it's responsible for all of sport. and then coordinate, develop amateur athletics. Again, then you get to the third and fourth one. Here's what we spend all our time doing. We have jurisdiction over the U.S. participation in the games and the conduct of the games in the U.S. Send the best teams. Support international athletics involving the U.S. The mission that we were looking at is we're trying to support athletes to achieve excellence on the field and embody the Olympic values and inspire people. That's a fraction of these 15 things that are on the list for us to do every day. And I'll be frank with you, we don't spend the same amount of time on all 15 of these things. We do not spend a lot of time on fostering development and availability of amateur athletic facilities, which if you read it a certain way would say we're in charge of building all the gyms across the country for kids in every sport, right? Or providing assistance to, for participation for a particular group of people. We're really focusing on everyone. But this shows the value judgment that you make in our country when you create an organization like this. When they were throwing it all together, they're saying, these are going to be the guys, put everything there. It makes perfect sense. That law is still on the books, so I'm not trying to steer anybody, but if you could get on any one of these things and complain that the USOC isn't doing that thing enough. But I think we will agree that even with the sponsorship revenue we've got, if we tried to do all those things, we'd be terrible at every one of them. So the organization has to pick its targets in a way, has to pick a mission, and that's what we talked about. So of all those things, we are focusing on a mission that focuses on the international competition and our country being able to participate at a high level and elite athletes getting the support that they need. It doesn't have to be that way, though. When we can have that argument, would it be better if we distributed our money, scattered it across the earth to build sport participation for kids generally so that they grow up to be good athletes in other ways? Would that be a thing to do? Should we spend it all on only some of the sports? Should we fund all the NGBs exactly the same way? That's an argument that you can have. So that's why I get to this punchline. This is the thing, and really anybody can play. I have a limited number of prizes available to somebody who wants to offer their thoughts on this. What do you need an Olympic Committee for? What is the reason for being for the U.S. Olympic Committee? And now we talked about this. We have to think internationally, right? Not just domestically. We play in this Olympic movement. If any part of you agrees that there's magic in the Olympics, when you look at particular athletes from our country or from another country, if you think there's something really cool about that, well, we owe a duty to that international Olympic movement. What should our role be? And then domestically, if we're the only guys in the U.S. that can give a kid a chance to get to the Olympic Games, what role do we need to play in sport domestically? Should we be about athletic achievement? This past year, I don't know if any of you guys follow this news because this is my whole life, so I think it's the only thing people talk about, but people have been grilling the USOC about its role in sport and about whether it should be doing more in the area of athlete safety, athlete support and wellness. There was this terrible, terrible, terrible guy in the sport of gymnastics who was doing grievous harm to kids under the guise of giving them medical support. Should the USOC spend its money to make sure a guy like that can't exist? Is that what you need an Olympic Committee to do? Focus on support and wellness? Or is it athletic achievement at the highest level to inspire kids who want to come in and participate in sport at all levels? Or do you try to do some of both, which is, right, is always what we end up trying to do. But where should Team USA be focused? And then the last thing, not trying to spike this thing, but inspiration. When you get to our mission, right, I talked about athletic achievement, values, and then to inspire all Americans. The reason I came to the USOC from the commercial world is because it means more to me to work hard on things that are part of this movement than it does to work at a perfectly wonderful company that is based on generating revenue, and there's nothing in the world wrong with trying to make money. But it doesn't make you want to work hard. What makes you want to work hard is that it matters to you if a thing goes well, right? I believe there's a little magic in the Olympic movement. When I see a kid at the training center, and I really do in Colorado Springs, meet people who were not going to be able to train at this level, except there is a training center, and they showed the drive and the skill, and their NGB sent them to the training center. Now they're living in this dorm with other elite athletes who are making sacrifices like theirs in other sports that they weren't going to meet. And it's making them really double down. I know I can do a thing now that I wasn't sure I could do before. That is exciting to me, and that's worth spending time and money on. Inspiring people, I say, is the most important reason to have a National Olympic Committee in our country. Not just the athletes that would participate, but their families and their friends, and then even just schmoes like me looking at them on TV. What we can do by inspiring people in the world of sport is valuable. So whatever you decide that we should be spending our money on, it's got to go toward inspiring people. So I was just saying, there's a terrible guy, athlete safety. Do we need to focus exclusively on that? Maybe not. But I will say this, even as your lawyer, I'm not inspiring people if they are afraid that they can't participate in sport because they're not going to be safe. That's not inspiring. It's the opposite of inspiring. I know I have a role in helping to make sure athletes are safer, or I'm never going to inspire anybody. So I know I can't leave that alone. Now the question is, how much of this and how much of that? So I'm going to stop there. Again, like I said, before we're done, we're going to look at one more short thing to remember, that this is about people. But we've been talking about the organization. You can see that we're a small part of a giant international loose group of organizations in pursuit of a general sport thing. You can see that in the US, we don't have our hands on all the 50 sports, but we have a role in their lives. You can see that we train some athletes directly, and then we provide funding for other people to train athletes in other places, and then we have to choose how we're going to spend that money. But all of those are dials that we could twist. And I'm telling you, as I showed you the mission argument that we're having, people are arguing now about, what do I need the USOC to do? Somebody else can't do better. So this is where I would love to talk about any thoughts you've got. Everything is valid in this thing. Any comments or questions about how does that make you think? In the world that we need to be in internationally and domestically, set up the way we are, what should we be focusing on? What do you want from your Olympic Committee?
Does the USOC see a role for itself in dealing with gender equity in the different sports? I'm thinking about, for example, the pay disparity that exists in this country between male and female soccer players.
Right, that's been in the news just recently with the women's soccer team. Hockey went through a similar kind of a thing. The USOC's, if you take where I'll give you 3 different ways that we're involved in that. One is that there are certain rules for NGBs in terms of supporting all athletes and not discriminating. So you can't be an NGB if you are discriminating. So we can't have a pay disparity to the extent that it discriminates against somebody. Now, the people in soccer will argue, no, we're not discriminating. The economics are different between the men's and women's sport, and we need to support them differently. So we're not going to go in and say, soccer, here's how the pay scale has to work in your revenue-producing part of your sport. But if they get way out of line, then we would cease to recognize them as an NGB. So we have a position on that. That's one. 2 is, but we're not playing a strong role in deciding how they should operate their model. The third thing I will say is, for our purposes, though, when we form the teams, Team USA, we're supporting men's and women's sports exactly the same way, and it goes by event and athlete rather than gender. So all of Team USA's teams in recent times have been slightly more female than male. All the women's sports are getting the same level of support. So in that little way, I think we're very much trying to be part of a very equal focus on men's and women's sports. But it is a huge question, and you can see it's coming up in sports where there's revenue implication. So hockey teams, there are professional women's and men's hockey leagues, and they're both struggling for support, same as in soccer. That's where that's really coming up. And it's a whole different interesting issue, is because I'm in an amateur athletics sphere. I'm trying to help people participate in sport, not where they get paid to do it, but where they're competing internationally. But the money is creeping into this in a number of sports. And the idea of the line between amateur and professional athletics is really getting very cloudy. So I think there's going to be more on that, and we're going to have to probably get involved in the conversation more.
So who is an NGB accountable to, if not the USOC, in terms of gender equity, for example? To piggyback on this topic.
Yeah, so who's an NF or an NGB answerable to? In our country, they're going to be subject to the same legal requirements, certainly as other employers and other sports organizations. Thank you for coming, you guys. So they're answerable to legal minimums. They're answerable to the rules of their international federation, their IF, which governs that sport globally. And then in this small way, they're answerable to us because you can't be an NGB if you don't live by the USOC's code of conduct.
I guess athletes
Yeah.
in terms of safety or gender equity or something like that. What step do the athletes, officials, administrators have to help hold the NGB accountable for the standards that the USOC has put in place? And yet, it often seems that it comes down to lawsuits. Is there not an intermediary step that the USOC provides or could provide maybe in the future to assist in some of those disputes?
No, it's a great question, and you built into your question sort of a failure of the NGB as against the USOC's rules and regulations, and that is where the USOC has to have a role and does. So here's, not to drag you all through this, and I can tell you a lot more offline, but we do have, under our bylaws, we've got procedures for an athlete to challenge their NGB. Come to the USOC and say, this NGB is not playing by your rules, and it's hurting me. I don't have a right to participate in the way I should. Or it's just not running itself in a way that's fair, even without regard to me. No, there's a process under what's called Section 9 of our bylaws. It says, I'm not getting my fair chance to compete. There's another one under Section 10, as we call it. That is, the NGB is breaking the rules and nobody's holding them accountable. So there's a way the ombudsman, and there is an athlete ombudsman at the USOC who's charged with helping athletes navigate all this stuff and figure out what their rights are. So the ombudsman gets involved in trying to see if there's an informal way of fixing this. If there isn't, under the Section 10 process, what the USOC will do is call the NGB and say, this person has explained why they think you're not playing by our rules. Tell us why you are. And we name an independent hearing panel from an athlete representative, a team representative, an independent one, and we will have a hearing under the USOC rules to see if they are complying. If the NGB is found not to be complying, and this happened recently, we will take away their NGB status or put them on probation. USA Boxing has been in that position in the past, where they had to come into compliance.
Has the USOC ever reconsidered their position for allowing for 2 NGBs per sport rather than 1? I know it's similar to deal with 1, but in the case of, again, gender equity, if you had a women's NGB and a men's NGB for each sport, might that help solve some of these issues? That's impossible because the USOC only recognizes 1 NGB per sport. But have you all, is that ever on the table?
Gender-specific NGB that's a really interesting concept. So the only complication that we start with is we are obligated, remember we play in the IOC's sandbox in a way. IOC works with all these international federations. We have to work with NGBs only if we can work with them only if they're recognized in the US by their IF. So in this scenario, it's an interesting case. Would there be a sport where you'd have a separate organization that focused on women's sports and men's sports, if they could both be recognized by the international federation so that they can submit teams to international competitions? There's no reason we couldn't recognize them both as an NGB, and that's never happened. And you're right, there's no reason that you couldn't find a way to make that happen. But we got to make it work under the IF and the IOC rules. We can't just recognize anybody we want, because ultimately the reason we're recognizing someone is to send athletes to these international competitions. And if the IF would say, I'm not going to let you compete, then we won't be helping the athletes. We won't be sending them to anything, right? That's a really interesting question, though, about what it takes to be a good NGB and whether that would help put pressure on underperforming NGBs if there's no other organization who, maybe not to replace them, would take a part of that thing. There's a thing under what's called Section 11 where an organization could say, he shouldn't be the NGB, I should be the NGB, and there's a hearing on that, too. So there's a way to replace the NGB, but I've never seen a co-NGB like that. What else? Anyone? Hey, Kathleen.
What about if the USOC wants to take bigger roles in efforts that they don't currently have the money for? What about increasing the pie, the numbers of the pie, by getting all of this new wealth by these IPOs, all these companies, increasing the number of sponsors or increasing the price of sponsorship? Is there room in the market for that? And also, are there any prohibitions of exclusive licensing? So there can only be one credit card company, there can only be one soda company, there can only be one, Facebook type or whatever. Are there any restrictions on that?
So, a couple of great questions there. There's more money around. Isn't there some way we can get some of that money, Silicon Valley money? That goes to both sponsorship and commercial kind of stuff and donations. So I'll tell you that our greatest fundraising is being done in California, where you've got individuals who care so much about a sport or about the Olympics that we're seeing more donations from people who are trying to use some of their wealth that way. So that's one thing. And we're trying to help people find ways to donate money in ways that are meaningful to them personally. So like the sailing thing I was talking about, rather than just dumping the money in the pot so we can spend it on anything, here's a person that said, I really want to see this discipline within sailing grow in the US, and I want to see it get more recognition. So I'll give you money, but you got to spend it all on finding a way to make that better. So that's happening a little bit. But then you get to this other question. Do you have to have exclusivity for sponsorships? And the US model is very much based on exclusivity. So now I'll talk from Visa. Visa Inc., the payments company. And I did a whole bunch of work there, but the only work I really liked was the sponsorship stuff and really only the Olympic stuff. Well, why is that? Because you've seen, I'm practically tear up when I watch my own videos. It is inspiring. And the rest of the tax work was not quite the same somehow. For me, many people are inspired by taxes. So it's inspiring. So why does Visa want to be a sponsor? Because I want to associate my little Visa brand, which is otherwise kind of all right, I'm going to put it right next to the rings. And now I'm getting this halo effect a little bit. I'm a guy who brings you this inspirational thing, or I'm a guy that's helping athletes get to the games. That means something for me. And it differentiates me from American Express. So if you're not going to give me exclusivity, I'm not sure I have a lot of money for you because I need to distinguish myself in the marketplace. If all my competitors, MasterCard and Amex and Visa are all sponsors, we might all do that. But I think you get a tiny fraction of the fee, right? Because you're kind of just giving a license to everybody and then it's up to them to market to it. Now, having said that, at the Tokyo Games, it was really interesting to me anyway. So Tokyo Games, huge budget, very expensive to put on. And if you pay attention to the press in this thing, people are wondering whether they're going to make it or not and make the budget work. They think they're going to make it work, and they're using a cultural element in Japan that challenges what I just said. They are selling multiple sponsorships in different categories. So more than one bank in Japan has rights to use the rings for different things. And the banks are ponying up this money, again, oversimplifying a little bit, but because they see the value in bringing the games to Japan, they feel a national pride in hosting a successful games. So they're willing to put up with a little bit of lack of exclusivity because they want to be on the team that's helping that happen. In the US, I don't know if I can get my chief marketing officer to be that sort of, altruistic or working on national pride. I need to make money. That's what I'm here to do, generate shareholder value. So I don't know if I'll do that non-exclusive deal, but it's a fair question about whether there would be some way to build in more money. Hey. Yeah.
Are you all involved with that, or is that kind of separate?
It is separate, but it is related. If you would consider coming to the law school tomorrow, we're going to talk about exactly that in the sports law class around midday because, to me, again, it's really interesting. So certain athletes have such magnetism themselves, right, such market value as a sponsor property. Michael Phelps, who had achieved such personal fame, he's got an agent and a fleet of lawyers, and they're out there doing deals with Kellogg's themselves. Now, Michael can't bring with him the rings. That's the thing that I bring, or the IOC, and they bring it through me in the US. But he brings Michael. Now, it is very much related because if I'm a really good sponsor, I want him and I want the rings and I want him in his Team USA uniform. And now my life is very complicated. I'm doing deals with more than one person. So it's separate deals, but very much related. And boy, for me, even if I'm being selfish, I want him to be famous and beloved because that's good for all athletes on Team USA. So I'm going to try to cooperate with that deal and try to make it work for all of us. But it gets to a point that this gentleman was making before. We're getting to, opportunities to generate revenue. The women's soccer team, they're having all this success right now in soccer. And they're not getting paid the same as the men are. But they're killing it, and they're generating real commercial value. This doesn't feel like it's working quite right. And there's a question of push-pull all the time for athletes. Not everybody gets to be Michael Phelps where you're famous the year round and everybody always wants to be with you. Your moment of marketability might be at the games. So you need to be able to sell your own sponsorships. And I'm not going to let you do it with the rings. And you're saying, you got to be kidding me. I'm an Olympian. That's why they want me to be on that poster. So the negotiation around that is getting to be more and more complicated. And as an Olympic committee, I think I have to help the athlete do that because I'm supporting the athlete. At the same time, it's how I earn money for all the athletes. So I can't just give it to the athlete, so it's quite complicated.
Do the athletes kind of get around that with the tattoos?
For example, on the rings. So that's really, there are a number of Olympians who have small Olympic rings tattoos, and they do turn up in print ads from time to time and on social media, and that does not get around it. It's still not okay. You got to airbrush your arm and not have the rings in the ad. We had a really cool swimmer ad where the athlete's tattoo was, it looked so good on the shot. It was so cool, and we had to make her airbrush it out, and I felt like such a jerk. But if we don't do that, then every athlete needs to be able to do that for their own benefit. So the answer is no. You can't even if you put the rings on in ink, you can't commercialize it. You can have the rings and you can show it off all the time and celebrate, and we think that's super cool. But if you use it to make money, then that's our thing.
So at the USOC, or maybe at your interaction with the IOC, what do you see as the threats to the Olympic movement? Our speaker last week talked about the corruption that seems inherent to some degree in the Olympics, what you see with happening in Tokyo now, or Salt Lake City, or the fewer cities maybe bidding on hosting the Olympics when they see that it might not be a great thing for their city.
Yeah.
Or exposure to lawsuits in a Larry Nassar case and things like that. I mean, what do you see as actual serious threats that you guys spend time talking about?
Yeah, so threats in the movement, let's do international and domestic, and there are a number, but they're very different questions. It's one of the reasons I think it's so interesting. We're just one of the players. Internationally, I think this idea of corruption and people cynically using the power of the movement for their own financial or their own political gain is the huge threat. It's always there, and it's never going to be totally resolved, but it continues to be a really important threat. And like I was saying, it's mostly about power, if you don't mind my saying so, in the global sports movement, because most of these people are volunteers. They're not getting rich by running sport. That's not always true. But the power and the attractiveness of that power leads to corruption in so many cases. And the Olympic movement has not been immune to that. So divorcing people who would misuse the power of the rings from the rings is a huge, it's really important for the movement, and there's a real threat to that because the people in power are always there because it attracts them, that same power. So it's hard for people to divorce themselves of that benefit in a way. So global corruption, I will tell you, I worked a lot with FIFA on the FIFA World Cup. I worked a lot with the IOC on the Olympics. And the IOC is, well, that sounds terrible, but corruption can be a problem in many sports. The IOC is not the worst of them. Can I say that? That is, so that it is, those same dynamics are in play across international sport. But the Olympic guys, I think they have a special duty in that area because the level of inspiration is higher for more people, and you can't play with that. You will screw that up if you aren't cleaner than people who are in a more commercial environment, where the FIFA World Cup is so fantastic, but it's very commercial and team-oriented. It's not quite that same inspiration thing. Domestically, currently, I think there is a real threat to the way things are working right now, and not to say that they have to work the way they're working right now, is we have this funny model where we're neither here nor there. We're not a monolithic government organization who can just run all the NGBs. And we can't ignore the NGBs and just leave them to their own devices. A thing like Larry Nassar happened in an environment in one of those 50 NGBs, and there were lawsuits on it and everything else, so I won't go deep into this, but a part of the problem there was it wasn't hard for a guy like that to sneak around in that environment. I can't ignore that. I don't think I can take it all over. So we're in the middle. So the threat to the movement in the US is, I think you could argue that you got to fish or cut bait. You got to do one or the other. You got to be in charge of the thing or not. And right now we're kind of in between. And I worry about that. The power of that is you harness this competition, you harness these smart people in their sports, we harness commercial value instead of taking tax dollars. The downside of it is the lack of control. And if it goes wrong, it's still on us. Even if I can tell you that I can't control it all, that doesn't help make people safe. We can't have that. Hi.
Since you mentioned Larry Nassar, what does the IOC see as its responsibility of providing medical attention, medical insurance, and, long-term care for athletes that may need it.
Yeah, the Nassar instance is it's an instance of a very big question that you're asking, which is what do we all owe our athletes through their lives?
Are the doctors all volunteers, or are they hired?
Yeah. So again, in this sort of amateur sports realm that we're in, I have at the USOC, when it's time to go to the games, I put a delegation together. And the delegation is athletes from the different sports and their support people that the NGBs want to send. At that moment, we all come together and we have a lot of interaction, and those are very often volunteers, very often very carefully screened. Then when they leave the games, then I don't see them again. So who's looking after them in that case? It varies totally by NGB. So there are athletes who have teams of professional medical people that are with them top to bottom. There are other athletes that come into infrequent contact with medical professionals and they only see volunteers in the sport. And it varies totally by sport, and by the model of that sport and its club system. So it's not consistent. And it's a fair question. Is there something we need to guarantee in terms of consistency for athletes at different times of their life and at different levels of competition? I mean, that's a fair question.
The USOC started Safe Sport.
Yeah.
Right. Are there plans to put more money into that, given the huge backlog that Safe Sport now has?
Yeah, so we're talking about the U.S. Center for Safe Sport, and I got to let you guys go, but I'll tell you a super short anti-doping story and why I'm hopeful about athlete safety from sexual abuse now. In the 1990s, we were having real doping problems in the U.S. We don't really have a lot of doping problems in the U.S. now. In the 1990s, each of the sports were looking after their own doping testing, and the USOC was involved in testing for doping. Inherent conflict there, because now I'm testing you, athlete, for drugs, but I really want you to win this event. So am I going to find the drugs? I hope I will. I hope I do a good job. But there's a conflict of interest there, right? So the same guy, I'm policing the person, and I'm also trying to support their success. That doesn't work quite right. So the USOC, going to 2000, created USADA, the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency. At first, they were working at the USOC, and then we pushed them off as a separate entity. Now they are a separate nonprofit where we provide significant funding, but the government provides funding, and they make money other ways, and they're totally separate from us. So they test the athletes. So I can have my coaches just trying to help the athletes succeed, and that guy is the drug testing guy, and he's not conflicted, and he's really good at it. And now our anti-doping system, though imperfect, is the class of the world. Now in the area of safe sport, when we come to the possibility of somebody, a coach, who could be abusing athletes in any number of ways, one of which would be sexual abuse. Same for a doctor. Who's looking after that? Well, we had, for the past 10 years, we've had policies that absolutely make that not okay and have rules for how you conduct things, and we had requirements of NGBs, but each NGB was hiring the doctor and the coach, and they want you to succeed, and they're checking him against the possibility that he's an abuser of some kind. But I need this doctor. We're crazy about this doctor. So a guy like Larry Nassar, if anybody reported him, he would have been in front of the NGB, USA Gymnastics, to be evaluated. There's a conflict there. So we created the U.S. Center for Safe Sport within the USOC. 2 years ago, we sent them off to be a separate entity. So like USADA, now, they're really good at this. They only care about finding evildoers and then posting their names on a searchable database. And it's not the same as the NGB or the USOC. So the conflict of interest is not there. So then you get to the question is, do they have what they need to get their work done? Now, they do have a backlog these days because they're getting on their feet. It's essentially a startup trying to do this work. Their choices have been to make sure they do the work well and then staff up to be able to do as much work as they'd like to. And it has created, in part, this backlog. We're the only source of funding for this organization right now, we and to a small extent the NGBs. We staked them to what we thought it was going to take to run this whole thing, and then we doubled that number last year because they needed more help, and then we doubled that money again this year. So they haven't, frankly, spent all the money that we've given them because they're trying to do a very careful job. But for Safe Sport to work right, they need to ultimately get to the same place USADA is, where they're getting money from other places, like the government. Then I think, then we've got that same kind of police force that's not conflicted. I really am hopeful for the success of that place, and it's in early days. definitely.
Trace, last question.
Yeah, this will probably end up being more of a comment than a question, but something that's particularly interesting, I guess, being on a college campus right now is the intersection between collegiate sport and Olympic sport and the success of the USOC and all that. I mean, you can talk about the most popular sports in the country would obviously start when you go football, basketball, baseball, down the list, but the two most popular sports, and I think this would be dictated by primetime viewership and slots and all that during the Olympics, is swimming and track. And those are also two sports where you see a ton of success by U.S. athletes. And what's interesting to me about that is I think the time period that those athletes are developing from kind of the youth level to the elite gold medal, the kids are all developing on campus. And so it comes with not a whole lot of expenses from the USOC, from USA Swimming. I know they provide funding. I just came from an institution where we had 5 to 10 athletes at any time who were getting funding from USA Swimming, but they're getting coaching from their college coaches. They in there, they don't go to the training facility, they stay there on the college campus, they live there. And so I think there's more so just to end with the fact that there's probably a lot of opportunity for partnership between the NCAA and the USOC. I know there's some various initiatives that are ongoing right now, but I think that's something that you could probably start to see a lot more of and you can maximize in the future too.
Like 80% of the Olympians at the Rio Games were NCAA athletes. So you're exactly right. That it's a hugely important partnership, and it's a question of whether we could do even more to take advantage of that, both for those athletes and their prospects, and for international competition. 100%. What's so interesting, though, this is one of my favorite things about this international movement: swimming and track. That's what every night. That's the primetime coverage on NBC. You're right. Highest viewership, very high U.S. success. I think those two things are tied, though, because when you go to Canada and you're watching the Olympics, it is curling and hockey. When you go to France, honestly, it's team handball is the primetime thing, and they're killing it in team handball. So these things do tend to fulfill themselves, and so really, that's one of the neat things about being on a global platform is we pick our favorite things and we pursue them, but it's a whole different story in different countries and their cultural sort of interests and that kind of thing. Do we have 30 seconds to look at, and then I'm going to shut up. So we were looking at Pyeongchang. It's the last games next summer. We will go to Tokyo.
Everything comes down to this moment. Allison Phoenix now starting to forward. There she goes. Katie Ledecky scratches her own world record as they come to the line. The big sweep is complete. Nobody does it like Simone. This has been your destiny all along. The U.S. makes history in Rio. And New York is going to do it all. Taylor Dressel at the wall gets it done. The dream has come true.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming all the way from